Crisis in Gaza, Leading Congregations to Understanding and Action, is a resource developed by the United Church of Christ Palestine-Israel Network to assist congregational leaders who want to engage their members in thoughtful study, discussion, and action toward a just peace in Palestine and Israel. We encourage congregational leaders to begin by reviewing the entire resource, then returning to more in-depth study of the many embedded links and videos provided on the slides, and then decide how best to introduce and share this resource with your congregation. As you can see on this slide, Crisis in Gaza is divided into 5 sections. Section 1, This is a Catastrophe, sets the current crisis in historical context, drawing a through line from the 1948 Nakba to now. Section 2 focuses on those most affected by the crisis, and in particular, long-standing Palestinian Christian partners, as they give voice to the suffering, the hope, and the commitment of Palestinian people and their allies in Israel and throughout the world. Section 3 introduces us to the story of United Church of Christ's involvement in Palestine and Israel over many years, the commitments made through multiple General Synod resolutions, and the work of UCC-PIN. Section 4 considers challenges that can get in the way of speaking out boldly and of taking courageous action in support of Palestinian rights and justice. Section 5 concludes with steps we can take immediately and over the longer term to accompany and support Palestinian partners to become increasingly informed about the issues that stand in the way of peace, and to be advocates in our own country for policies that support efforts for peace with justice. To begin, go to the next slide and listen to an introductory message from the Reverend John Thomas, former General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ, and a member of the steering committee of the United Church of Christ Palestine-Israel Network.
Since October 7th, pastors and lay leaders have, in many cases, struggled to find the words and identify the actions required for an adequate Christian response to the crisis in Gaza. Some feel that they don't know enough of the history or of the contemporary context in order to offer informed perspectives. Some are concerned about potential responses from neighboring Jewish congregations. Some find the current political context in Palestine and Israel excruciatingly complex, a complexity made even more challenging by the polarized state of our own country's politics. But we all know that the assault on life that we have witnessed, particularly in light of our own country's involvement, demands a response from the church. Silence is not an option. The United Church of Christ Palestine-Israel Network is a grassroots organization founded 13 years ago to inform UCC members about the situation in Palestine and Israel, and to encourage advocacy for policies that would lead toward a just and lasting peace for all. This collection of resources provides help to congregations and to their leaders, both to address the current crisis, but also to be involved in advocacy that will bring that crisis to an enduring end. Toward the end of 1942, Dietrich Bonhoeffer prepared a letter to be circulated to pastors following what he hoped would be an end to the war brought about by a coup to end the Nazi regime. In that letter to pastors, he wrote, "No pastor can do justice today to his ministry by himself. He needs his brothers. We ask you to come together to prepare your sermons with prayer and to help one another find the proper words. This resource, offered at another urgent time, is printed in that same spirit, hoping to help you find the proper words. This year, the lectionary readings for Christmastide did not include Matthew's story of the slaughter of the innocents by Herod, who feared that the infant born in Bethlehem would one day grow to challenge his rule. Yet we have been witnessing this reality now for over 3 months. First, on October 7th, as Israeli communities near the border with Gaza were attacked, where close to 1,200 were killed, Israeli civilians, Israeli military personnel, and foreign nationals, and over 200 taken hostage. Israel's brutal response and an ongoing military assault on the people of Gaza is continuing that slaughter. As of January 7th, when this is being recorded, over 21,000 people, majority of them innocent civilians, have been killed. Countless more wounded, with their homes, hospitals, and places of worship destroyed, and over 1.9 million Gazas displaced to shelters without adequate access to food, water, fuel, and safety from attack. In 2020, our Christian partners in Palestine, leaders of the various churches, wrote in a letter titled "Cry for Hope" that things are beyond urgent. We, they said, are on the verge of catastrophic collapse. Recalling these prophetic warnings from 3.5 years ago reminds us that the current crisis did not begin on October 7th. And they suggest that no matter how many Palestinians are killed, how many are wounded or displaced, no matter how much of the physical infrastructure of Gaza is destroyed by Israeli bombardment, no matter how many Hamas fighters are killed or how many hostages released, the crisis will not end simply with a ceasefire. Only a peace born of justice rather than violence will bring a future adequate to the vision of God for Palestinians and Israelis alike. For many of our congregations, the crisis experienced by the Palestinian people for 75 years since the establishment of the State of Israel seems geographically distant, morally perplexing, politically complex. A history of conflict beyond solutions, shrouded in narratives distorted by American media, politicians, conservative Christians, and Jewish organizations like the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC. The fear of being labeled anti-Semitic silences needed dialogue, as well as legitimate criticism of the policies and actions of the State of Israel. As a result, for many congregations, the response has been, at best, limited to prayer for victims, prayer for peace, an appropriate, but not a sufficient response. The urgent crisis today in Palestine and Israel, with its polarizing effects here in the United States, offer an opportunity and a call to our congregations for study, for understanding, for theological reflection, and for advocacy with our own government for justice, for the upholding of human rights, the defense of international law, and an embrace of nonviolent solutions to the conflict. Why is this important for our churches? Many of us have Jewish neighbors struggling with their own reactions to the current crisis. They have their own deeply felt commitments to Israel, their own communal history of trauma, and their justifiable fears of rising anti-Semitism. Regardless of how these Jews view Israel's assault on Gaza, and those views are diverse, these neighbors deserve our compassionate concern. We also have Palestinian neighbors. These neighbors, for the most part, are not geographically close, although, in fact, there are many Palestinians and Palestinian Americans of descent in the United States. But through the United Church of Christ, we maintain long-standing and very close partnerships with Palestinian Christians in the Middle East. Support and solidarity for their leaders, organizations, and their institutions. We have pledged to them our commitment to be with them, to support them, and to accompany them. And as American citizens, we are complicit in our own country's support for nearly 60 years of occupation. Respected human rights organizations and our own General Synod have determined that Israel's matrix of control meets the international definition of apartheid. Palestinian Christian leaders who are our UCC partners call what is happening in Gaza genocide. And certainly many of the actions we're witnessing in Gaza meet the international legal standard for that definition. Silence in the face of the Israeli occupation, silence in the face of Christian readings of scripture that support that occupation, silence in the face of this contemporary slaughter of innocents and flight of refugees from violence is, as our Palestinian Christian partners have said, a sin. This resource is offered now in the hope that it can assist pastors wanting to encourage deeper understanding of the current crisis, as well as advocacy for U.S. policies that will support nonviolent resistance to the occupation by Palestinians, by Israelis, and American Christians, Jews, and Muslims. 60 years ago, in his letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us that oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The urge for freedom will eventually come. He went on to point out that if the urge does not come out in nonviolent ways, it will come out in ominous expressions of violence. This, he said, is not a threat. It is a fact of history. For 75 years, even Palestinian nonviolent resistance to Israeli domination of their lives and their pleas to the international community to fulfill the promise of a sovereign state has only led to increased repression and enduring disappointment. As a result, the attacks on October 7th, while not morally justified, were, as King warned, utterly predictable. The horrors of the recent months cry out to us for another way. And here we are instructed again by our Palestinian Christian friends who write of the hope that is grounded in the logic of love. Our call, they said, is rooted in the logic of love that seeks to liberate both the oppressor and the oppressed in order to create a new society for all the people of the land. We continue to hold firm to that hope, they wrote, that Palestinians and Israelis have a common future, that we can organize our political life with all its complexity according to the logic of love and its power after ending the occupation and establishing justice. As followers of Jesus, our response to ideologies of exclusivity and apartheid is to uphold a vision of inclusivity and equality for all peoples of the land, and to persistently struggle to bring that about. We hope you will want to join them and join us in this shared vision of hope and in this shared work of justice.
For Palestinians, the events surrounding the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and the Israeli invasion of Gaza following October 7th were and are a catastrophe. The word is Nakba in Arabic. The parallels between these two moments in history are hauntingly similar, as history seems to be repeating itself. Take a moment to look carefully at these two pictures. The one on the left shows Palestinians today, already refugees in Gaza, now displaced from their homes, fleeing Israeli bombardment and attacks. The one on the right shows Palestinians, likely parents or grandparents of present-day Palestinians, driven in 1948 from their homes and villages in Palestine, now permanent refugees in what is the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Lebanon, and the wider global diaspora. The trauma of displacement and loss is not just a historical reality. It is a lived experience of Palestinians every day. This map and the accompanying text describe the Nakba of 1948. While 1948 is a pivotal year in the story of Palestine, the seeds of loss and displacement go back to the early 20th century, when the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the decisions of the great powers following the First World War allowed Great Britain and other European colonial powers, along with the United States, to carve up the Middle East for their own benefit and begin the process of Jewish migration from Europe to Palestine. These decisions took little account of the rights of the indigenous Palestinian population. What happened on October 7th shocked the world, but it was over a century in the making. While we are often familiar with heroic tales of Holocaust survivors claiming a place of safety and security after their own trauma in Europe, we are often unfamiliar with what this meant for Palestinians and their trauma. As you view the map showing the location of Palestinian villages depopulated in 1948, read the startling statistics and description of what happened to Palestinians who had lived in this region for centuries. These maps show the dramatic shrinkage over time of Palestinian land due to the UN partition in 1948, Israel's 1967 occupation, the annexation of East Jerusalem, and the relentless expansion of Israeli Jewish settlements, all illegal under international law. While in 2005 Israel withdrew its settlements in Gaza, Israeli settlements on stolen Palestinian land in the West Bank have mushroomed. According to the United Nations Human Rights Council, well over 700,000 Israeli settlers now live in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. Settler-only highways, often referred to as sterile highways, are barred to Palestinians for travel, but give settlers direct access from the settlements into Israel. The combination of these highways and Israeli checkpoints makes travel for Palestinians, whether for employment, education, healthcare, and religious observances, difficult, if not impossible. In 2002, Israel began constructing a wall, variously known as the separation wall, the security barrier, or the apartheid wall. Also illegal under international law, this wall, 25 feet high in many areas, deviates from the green line drawn in 1948 to mark the division between Israel and the West Bank. In many places, the wall snakes its way, penetrating deeply into the West Bank, dividing Palestinian land there into non-contiguous islands, and often walling villages off from their agricultural lands and ancestral olive groves. West Bank settlements, at least one as large as 800,000 people, are seen by many Israelis, including the current Israeli cabinet, as the precursor for the complete annexation of all Palestinian land extending from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. For United States citizens familiar with the history of dispossession of land from our own indigenous population of Native Americans, these maps are eerily and tragically familiar. Who lives in Gaza now? Over 70% of the residents are refugees or descendants of refugees from 1948. As this slide explains, the Nakba of 1948 radically transformed Gaza, with over 200,000 Palestinian refugees displaced from other parts of Palestine, crowded then into 8 refugee camps in Gaza. The current population of over 2 million has been crowded into a strip of land slightly larger than Manhattan and the Bronx in New York City. Since October 7th, with Israel's relentless war on Gaza, over 85% of these Palestinians have now been further displaced. In 2005, Israel removed its soldiers and settler communities from Gaza, but has maintained a strict blockade of Gaza since 2007. The ensuing 16 going on 17 years of life in what many have called the largest open-air prison in the world have been profoundly difficult, as the description of life in this slide documents. Only the humanitarian assistance provided through the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, known as UNRWA, and operating since 1950, has made life for Gaza's residents viable at all. Gaza has not only been a crowded, economically strangulated place under siege, it has also been the target of Israel's numerous military assaults, documented on this slide. Even the Great March of Return in 2018 and 2019, a non-violent effort by Gazans to communicate to the world their right and desire to return to their stolen homes and lands, was met with Israel's armed assault, leading to the deaths of over 200 Palestinians and injuries to over 36,000 more. This long and painful history can seem overwhelmingly complicated, but the central themes are not. Take a moment now to view, on the next slide, the short 6.5-minute video by Jewish Voice for Peace, which provides a readily accessible review of the 75 years of the ongoing Nakba.
What would happen if you built a refuge for a persecuted people in a place where another people already lived? In the next few minutes, you'll learn why this moral quandary is at the root of the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, and what you can do to help achieve a just peace for everyone in the region. First, there are a couple of things it's helpful to understand. One, many Jews fled harsh persecution in anti-Semitic Europe especially the Nazi Holocaust. Zionists encouraged massive immigration to historic Palestine, at that time a British colony, where Jews had an age-old connection and where small Jewish communities had long existed among larger groups of indigenous peoples. But when the UN offered the Jewish immigrants the majority of the land for a new state called Israel, for the indigenous Palestinians who lived there, it was a massive destruction of life. They rejected the UN's partition plan, and several Arab states invaded the new state of Israel. Israeli forces essentially erased over 400 Palestinian villages and towns. By the end of the fighting, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. And when 750,000 Palestinians who fled or were expelled during fighting tried to return to their homes where the new state now stood, they were permanently barred by the Israeli government. While over 100,000 of their relatives and neighbors who hadn't left became second-class citizens of the new state, along with the new Jewish majority. Today, Palestinian refugees and their descendants number in the millions. Most are in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Jordan. Many are spread throughout the world, with millions still living in refugee camps, seeking to return to their homeland. To sum up, one group of refugees found a much-needed home. But in the process, a new group of refugees was created. Here's the second thing to understand. Israel was founded as a Jewish state. But now ask yourself, what exactly does that mean? People had lots of ideas about what a Jewish state should look like. Some called for equality for all citizens. But what was created, in practice, was institutional discrimination against non-Jews. In other words, Israel ended up being built on a blueprint of exclusion. The Israeli government wants maximum land and resources for Jews, but not the Palestinians living there. That's why, inside Israel, Jews get special privileges, including rights to land and housing, that are denied to the Palestinian citizens, who make up 20% of Israel's population. That's also part of why Israel has never defined its borders. In fact, they still hold on to land, the West Bank and Gaza, that they conquered in the war in 1967. Since then, Israel has built Jewish settlements throughout the occupied West Bank, building Jewish-only cities and supplying them with infrastructure like roads and army camps, schools, and even a college. Military occupations are meant to be temporary, but after 40-plus years, this one looks permanent and entirely unjust. In the West Bank, Israeli Jewish settlers and Palestinians live on the same land, but must live under two completely separate and unequal systems of Israeli law. The Jewish settlers dominate the natural resources, including water and agricultural land, and they're backed by the Israeli army. To maintain the occupation, Israel has demolished thousands of Palestinian homes and orchards, confiscated Palestinian land, bombed a captive civilian population in Gaza, and punished resistance with raids, arrests, and assassinations, all to gain maximum land while making life so difficult for Palestinians that they will either leave or be too afraid to resist. Palestinians have fought back. For decades, they tried to achieve national liberation through armed struggle. Some groups still do. But the majority now support popular protest instead. The deeply harmful pattern of control, repression, and violence profoundly harms Palestinians living under occupation and Israelis living as occupiers. This must be broken to reach a peaceful and secure future for both peoples. Now that you understand the problem, what about the solution? What about peace talks? So far, over 2 decades of U.S.-backed peace talks have actually made things worse by helping Israel continue the occupation. It's been years of talking while Israel massively expanded the Jewish settlements and literally redrew the map. Peace talks are good if they're real, but not when they're theater to cover a land grab. So now what? The current world superpower, the United States, has been a terrible friend, enabling Israel's destructive and self-destructive expansion onto Palestinian land by funding the Israeli military, the biggest recipient of U.S. foreign aid in the world. But there's another superpower that can make the difference. You. There's a movement with hundreds of thousands of people just like you across the world, including Palestinians and Israelis, protesting, educating, divesting, and boycotting, all to bring nonviolent international pressure on Israel to stop violating human rights of Palestinians. Throughout history, where governments have failed to push for justice, people just like you, like us, have taken the lead and won. Now it's the Palestinians' turn for freedom and justice. We can pressure Israel to end the occupation and the discrimination. We want all people, Jews and Palestinians, to have equality, human rights, and democracy. We can change history. Join us.
For years, Palestinians have been telling us that Israel's occupation and matrix of control is apartheid. Highly respected international leaders like President Jimmy Carter and Archbishop Desmond Tutu have agreed. They, too, described Israel's domination of Palestinians and its system of physical separation and unequal legal treatment as apartheid, according to the legal definition shown on this slide and codified in international statutes and conventions. Recently, several highly respected human rights organizations, on the basis of their investigations, have concluded that Israel's policies do fit the legal definition of apartheid. One of these groups is B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization that is a partner of our United Church of Christ Global Ministries. Others include Amnesty International, Al-Haq, a Palestinian human rights organization based in Ramallah, and Human Rights Watch. You can access these extensively researched reports through the links on this slide. They document the fact that what Palestinians face is not simply prejudice, but deeply embedded structural conditions, illegal under international law, that deny Palestinians their freedom and human rights and dramatically inhibit their capacity to thrive economically, politically, socially, and culturally. For a fuller discussion of apartheid in the Israeli-Palestinian context, watch this 14.5-minute video on the next slide, produced by Amnesty International, Australia.
When you hear the word apartheid, what do you think of? Probably the disturbing images of racial segregation between whites and blacks in South Africa, where a regime ruled by a racist white minority declared themselves officially superior to the black majority, then proceeded to dominate them. South Africa's apartheid system officially ended in the mid-1990s, but that doesn't mean apartheid can't happen elsewhere. Here, in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, Palestinians are being forced off their land and out of their homes, separated and segregated by laws, walls, and checkpoints. They live in a constant state of fear and insecurity, and deliberately impoverished. While, on the other hand, Israeli authorities have given the Jewish Israeli population privilege over Palestinians in just about every facet of life. The question is, does this all amount to the crime of apartheid? First, the definition of apartheid. The crime against humanity of apartheid is perpetrated when particular serious human rights violations are committed with the purpose of establishing and maintaining a system of domination by one racial group over another and systematically oppressing them. But does this system exist in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories?
And there's been a growing debate about whether the situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories is apartheid. And now is the time for us, as the world's largest human rights organization, to offer up our analysis. Our findings and criticism are directed not at the Jewish people, but at the Israeli state. It's the Israeli state that put in place the policies that implement the laws and the practices that oppress Palestinians.
Well, Israeli leaders have been clear about their intentions from the beginning. In 1948, just before he became the first Prime Minister of Israel, Ben-Gurion visited Lifta and other Palestinian areas near Jerusalem that were completely emptied of Palestinian residents following attacks by Jewish forces. He stated, "There are no Arabs, 100% Jews. If we persist, it is quite possible that in the next 6 or 8 months there will be considerable changes in the country, very considerable, and to our advantage." More than 70 years later, then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu posted on Instagram that Israel is not a state of all its citizens, but rather the nation-state of the Jewish people and only them. So, it's no surprise that Israel built a system of racially discriminatory laws, policies and practices that privilege only Jewish people. And Palestinians, well, Palestinians live there too. They were there before Israel was established. But, as we will explain, they've been trapped for decades in a system that treats them as a lesser, non-Jewish racial group. Before Israel was established in 1948, Palestinians comprised most of the population, around 70%, and owned the vast majority of private land, about 90%, in what was British Mandate Palestine. Jews, many of whom had emigrated from Europe, comprised around 30% of the population, and they and Jewish institutions owned about 6.5% of the land.
The port of Haifa in Palestine lies shattered by bombs and strewn with dead.
In the course of establishing Israel as a Jewish state in 1948, Israeli authorities acted to turn the situation on its head and were responsible for the mass expulsion of Palestinians and the destruction of hundreds of villages, forcing around 800,000 Palestinians out of their homes and lands. Thousands of Palestinians and Jews were killed in the context of attacks on civilians during this conflict. Today there are around 6 million Palestinian refugees who Israel denies the right to return to their homes. After the 1967 war, Israel occupied the Palestinian territories of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. Israel's brutal military rule, coupled with the establishment and expansion of illegal Jewish settlements, has coerced Palestinians into enclaves, creating further fragmentation and segregation. The objective? Maintain Jewish-Israeli hegemony and maximize control of land. In the city of Jerusalem, the Israeli official policy is to maintain at least a 60% Jewish majority.
If you've always felt a deep yearning for Jerusalem, now is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity not only to stand within its gates, but also to build the home of your dreams there.
So where do all the Palestinians live now? 3.4 million live outside of Israel in the occupied territories, mainly in refugee camps in neighbouring countries. 2.5 million Palestinians live in Israel and East Jerusalem, restricted to enclaves that make up around 3% of the entire area. 3 million Palestinians live in the occupied West Bank, but are only allowed to access 40% of the land to live and work. The rest of the area is for the Jewish Israeli settlers only. 2 million are trapped in the Gaza Strip, one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Fragmentation of the Palestinian society and the dispossession of their lands are key pillars of Israel's apartheid system to maintain domination and control. But there's more. The unequal structure of nationality and status, restrictions on freedom of movement, use of military rule, denial of right to political participation or the right to peaceful protest, and cruel separation of families all add to the complex system that we see today.
The world in general hasn't woken up to the fact that there is an entrenched system of oppression against Palestinians across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, wherever they may live, by the Israeli state. It's a system that's been put in place and maintained for decades, and it's that system that is the root cause of so many of the violations, the misery and the suffering that millions of Palestinians face on a daily basis.
One way to understand this segregation and oppression is to look at the ID system. Jewish Israelis have only one ID card, with a status that grants them the rights to live almost anywhere they wish in the country. They can move freely with access to healthcare and vast resources. Palestinians, on the other hand, have 4 types of ID cards, if any at all. The kind of ID card you are given determines the level of rights you can enjoy and controls where you can go and what you can do. If you hold a green card, you are subject to military rule. And if you have a green card with a Gaza address, it means you're trapped in a 365 kilometre square open-air prison under Israeli military blockade in place since 2007. Israel controls what goes in and what goes out, from children's toys to medical supplies. 90% of the people have no access to safe drinking water, 47% are unemployed, 56% live in poverty. Palestinians with a Gaza ID are forbidden from going to Jerusalem in the West Bank, even if they have family there. Some people in the West Bank are considered to live there illegally and can be deported immediately to Gaza if found by the army, even if they have been in the West Bank for decades. Whereas, if you hold a green card which has a West Bank address, then you live here. This green card means you can live within specific enclaves surrounded by illegal Israeli settlements. And there's a separation wall and fences built around you since 2002, which Palestinians call the Apartheid Wall. It's 8 meters high in places and 700 kilometers long. That's twice the height of the Berlin Wall and more than 4 times its length. 80% of it is built inside the West Bank, occupying even more Palestinian land. There are separate roads for Israelis and Palestinians, hundreds of checkpoints scattered throughout, not to mention the 54 years of occupation which has devastated the lives of millions of Palestinians. Palestinians with a West Bank ID can travel to Gaza or East Jerusalem, but only if they receive a permit from the military to do so. This blue ID is for Palestinians in East Jerusalem. They can travel to the occupied West Bank as well as to Israel, but they are not citizens of Israel. They have only been granted a residency status. This means that they cannot vote in Israeli national elections, and if they leave East Jerusalem for too long, for example to study or work abroad or in other parts of the occupied West Bank, their residency is revoked, so they can't return. Since 1967, Israel has revoked the residency status of more than 14,600 Palestinians from East Jerusalem. Finally, Palestinian citizens of Israel. They have been through it all. They are the group that remained in Israel despite the ethnic cleansing in 1948. They lived under Israeli military rule that applied only to them and not Jewish Israelis for 18 years, between 1948 and 1966. They were made citizens but can never become nationals and enjoy equality unless they become Jewish, which the law prohibits. They are the only Palestinians who can run and vote in Israeli elections, and they can move relatively freely, but the inequality against them was never dismantled, and they face daily institutional discrimination, including as members of parliament. And if this complex ID system wasn't enough to segregate the Palestinian community, in 2002, Israel introduced a law that prohibits family unification. That's right, denying Palestinians the right to live with their loved ones if their ID cards are different. And this woman is one of thousands of Palestinians who Israel will not issue any ID card. She can't travel, can't hug her family, only see them meters away across the border. Putting down roots, the family home, these are crucial parts of what make a strong community. To make sure Palestinian communities can't develop any further, Israel has made it almost impossible to grant building permits for Palestinian homes. So, Palestinians live in a catch-22 situation. In order to have shelter or develop their communities, they must build without a permit. And if they do so, Israel can demolish the structures on the basis that it was built without a permit. Right now, there are over 150,000 Palestinians currently living under the constant threat of demolition and forced eviction, many of them for the second or third time. In the West Bank, an average of 18 Palestinian structures were demolished every week in 2020. The same year, Israel issued 1,094 building permits for Jewish applicants, and only one for a Palestinian. This goes back to the heart of the issue. To maintain the state's character as Jewish, Israel systematically disadvantages Palestinians while privileging Jewish Israelis. This racist privilege has been enshrined in laws, policies and practices, and it enables Palestinian resources to be taken in order to economically benefit Jewish Israeli citizens.
The system of apartheid is the Israeli state's oppression and domination of Palestinians on a daily basis. It's the laws, the policies and the practices that it puts in place and then implements to control Palestinians' daily lives. And then the crimes of apartheid. The crimes of apartheid are those acts, those violations, those patterns of violations that Israel is committing to create and then maintain that system of apartheid.
Amnesty International and other rights organisations have been documenting patterns of human rights violations and international crimes for decades. These are the most visible and violent part of this system. At the end of May 2020, 4,236 Palestinians were held in Israeli prisons, and 352, including 2 children, were held without charge or trial. Between September 2000 and February 2017, Israeli forces killed 4,868 Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories, including 1,793 children, outside the context of armed conflict. And Amnesty International is not aware of any case in which an Israeli soldier has been convicted of willfully causing the death of a Palestinian in the occupied territories since 1987. This imbalance of rights, justice and accountability is never more clear than when a Jewish Israeli life appears to have more value than a Palestinian's. Israel's apartheid and its cruel and prolonged strategies deliberately disadvantage Palestinians wherever they live. They cannot claim and enjoy equality with Jewish Israelis.
Look, everyone can make a difference. Together, we need to speak out on behalf of Palestinians. We need to speak about the human rights violations that they are suffering. We need to talk about the apartheid, the system of apartheid to which they are subjected. Because by campaigning together, putting pressure on the Israeli state, we can have this system of apartheid dismantled. Join us, join our campaign. Everyone has the power to make a difference.
In the context of the ongoing Nakba and the conditions of apartheid, what is happening in Gaza now? The attack by Hamas fighters on Israeli communities October 7th was horrific. It cannot and should not be defended. Neither can the violence of Israel's months-long assault on Gaza in response. The magnitude of this contemporary Nakba is staggering in terms of Palestinians killed, Palestinians missing, Palestinians injured, Palestinians displaced, Palestinian infrastructure destroyed, and now hundreds of thousands of Palestinians at risk of starvation, without adequate food, access to medical care, sheltering without housing in areas still subjected to continual Israeli bombing and attack. The statistics on this slide represent just one point in time. They are increasing every day before our very eyes, a slaughter of innocents and collective punishment. Gaza's refugee camps have not been spared by Israel's assault. As this slide documents, all 8 of the camps, which we saw were established after 1948, have been systematically bombed by Israel, and residents have had to flee. These camps in almost all of Gaza have been rendered virtually uninhabitable, raising the question of what happens when Israel's current war on Gaza ends. This is a massive humanitarian crisis. And it is also a challenging political crisis. Who will decide and control plans for the future of Gaza? What say will its population have? will the rights and sovereignty and the voice of Palestinians be respected? And this is also an urgent moral crisis, which the international community and the Church must face and address. Is Israel's assault on Gaza today genocide? Our Palestinian Christian partners believe it is, and they have asked us to name it as such. The South African government believes it is, prompting them to bring their case against Israel before the International Court of Justice. And on January 26, the court ruled there is plausible evidence that Israel is committing genocide, based on the definition in the Genocide Convention adopted by the United Nations in 1948. That convention defines genocide as a crime committed with the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in whole or in part. The court will continue to investigate before making their final determination. But meanwhile, in their 26th of January ruling, the court, with near unanimous support from its judges, handed down provisional measures binding on Israel to prevent further killing and harm to Gazans, and to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian aid to Gazans. Follow the link on this page to read the full ruling of the International Court of Justice.
Jesus, born under the rubble. Here, we see that art is a gruesome depiction of real life in Gaza. For Christmas Day 2023, members of the Evangelical Lutheran Christmas Church in Bethlehem, Palestine, they posted a picture of the infant Christ lying alone in the rubble. Suffering, death, destruction, and the hope of resurrection is a depiction of real life for the people who live there. Too many American trips to the Holy Land begin and end with a visit to the ancient sites associated with biblical stories. People who are Muslim and Jewish are usually the most visible people we see in Palestine and Israel. But there are vibrant communities of Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant believers who have been there for centuries. The members of their churches and schools are among the most powerful voices for peace with justice in the land. The United Church of Christ maintains close partnerships with these communities. As part of our partnership commitment to the Palestinian Christian communities, the United Church of Christ congregations are called to listen and respond to their voices. One voice comes from the Reverend Munther Isaac, pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Christmas Church in Bethlehem. In his Christmas sermon this year, he challenged the church in the U.S. and elsewhere for its shallow words of empathy without direct action. Listen to the passionate plea from this friend, colleague, and partner. Reverend Isaac is not the only one. For more than 3 decades, Palestinian theologians have drawn from the insights of liberation theology to reflect the impact of the gospel in their lives. In the words of the Sabeel Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center, the work is to strive towards theological liberation through instilling the Christian faith in the daily lives of those who suffer under occupation, violence, injustice, and discrimination. Since 2009, a group of Christian theologians have issued a series of insightful statements. Building on the 1985 Kairos documents in South Africa, they apply the gospel to the conditions of occupation and apartheid in Palestine. These documents have informed the UCC General Synod resolutions. They also challenged Christians around the world to help the people of Palestine achieve a non-violent struggle for freedom. Links to 3 of their important statements can be found here.
Greetings to you on behalf of the National Ministries of the United Church of Christ and Global Ministries of the UCC and the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, our shared missional ministry that nurtures relationships with almost 300 partners around the world, including in the Middle East. My name is Peter McCary, and I serve you as Global Relations Minister for the Middle East and Europe in Global Ministries. Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation and to learn about the UCC's involvement in the Middle East, both now and for the longer term. The Middle East, including Palestine, Israel, has a special resonance for us in the UCC. Of course, we trace our Christian faith history back 2 millennia to the biblical places of Christ's birth, life, ministry, passion, crucifixion, death, and resurrection. Today, we also continue a mission history of more than 200 years. The first congregational missionaries arrived in Jerusalem in the early 1820s, and the UCC has been involved with Palestinians since its early years, including working with and responding to the needs of those Palestinians forced from their homes and communities during the Nakba, or catastrophe. We are proud to be in partnership with the Palestinian Christian community, including Palestinian churches and ecumenical bodies, service agencies, and schools and institutions of higher learning. In Gaza, our primary partners are the Middle East Council of Churches Department of Service for Palestinian Refugees, which has programs in vocational training for young adults like carpentry, trauma therapy classes for children and youth, and medical clinics, including care for women and children. And Al Ahli Arab Hospital, a hospital owned and run by the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem. Both of these partners have continued to provide critical service, despite the extremely challenging circumstances they have faced in the last several weeks. In addition, we have supported programs of the Palestinian YMCA and YWCA in Gaza and their responses to the current crisis across Palestine. Partnership means accompaniment and solidarity, especially important at times of crisis, but it is a long-term commitment to be present together, including offering support and sometimes mission personnel. And the UCC, with our identity as a just peace church, has a deep concern for justice and peace, something for which we have consistently advocated in the Middle East for decades through General Synod resolutions, statements, and action alerts. One way we advocate is ecumenically, with Churches for Middle East Peace, of which the United Church of Christ is a founding member. CMEP is a coalition of more than 30 national church communions and organizations, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, and Evangelical, that encourage U.S. policies that actively promote a comprehensive resolution to conflicts in the Middle East with a holistic perspective, emphasizing human rights, security, and justice for Israelis, Palestinians, and all people of the Middle East. Especially during the last several weeks, during the crisis in Gaza, we have been deeply involved in public witness through several statements and letters to elected officials through Churches for Middle East Peace. We also work ecumenically to support justice and peace through our partnership with the Middle East Council of Churches, as well as our membership and engagement with the National Council of Churches in the USA, Church World Service, and the World Council of Churches, including its program with the Jerusalem Churches, the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestine and Israel. Over the course of the decades of our history, the UCC has been consistent in statements and positions on the Middle East. In General Synod, delegates have been clear in their vision and hopes for Israelis and Palestinians since it first spoke on the Middle East in 1967, just a few weeks after the war in the region. General Synod has been clear in its approach and positions, which include a clear opposition to violence, the assertion of the Palestinian right of self-determination and sovereignty, support for a shared Jerusalem, open and accessible to Israelis and Palestinians, Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, affirmation of the rights of Palestinian refugees, as called for in UN Resolution 194, calls to end the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land, illegal under international law, including an end to settlement construction and expansion, and critique and condemnation of Israel's separation barrier, built on Palestinian land, which has impacted Palestinian lives and livelihoods in many negative ways. General Synod has advocated for the human rights of children living under Israeli occupation, insisting that Palestinian children be treated in accordance with international juvenile justice standards, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the UCC was among the first churches to call for the use of economic measures to promote peace in the Middle East, including positive contributions to groups and partners, challenging the practices of corporations that gain from the continuation of the conflict, and divesting from those companies that profit from the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories, and boycotting products produced in those territories, as well as advocating with our elected representatives in government to oppose military aid to the region. More recently, in 2021, the UCC's General Synod adopted a resolution called A Declaration for a Just Peace in Palestine and Israel. That resolution represented an important shift in that it moved the UCC from advocacy from a proscriptive outcome to an emphasis on a rights-based approach, drawing on consistent calls from Palestinian partners. That resolution affirms that justice, understood both as adherence to the message of the Hebrew prophets and the life and teachings of Jesus, as well as to applicable international laws, is the fundamental and requisite principle which must guide a peaceful future for Israel and Palestine. Among other things, the resolution names continued oppression of the Palestinian people, remaining a matter of theological urgency, and represents a sin. Rejects any theology or ideology, including Christian Zionism, supersessionism, anti-Semitism, or anti-Islam bias that would privilege or exclude any one nation, race, culture, or religion within God's universal economy of grace. Rejects any laws and legal procedures which are used by one race or religion or political entity to enshrine one people in a privileged legal position at the expense of another, including Israel's apartheid system of laws and legal procedures, and affirms that a just resolution of conflicting claims is only achieved through the equal protection of civil rights, the fair and just sharing of land and resources, and peaceful negotiation based on international law and UN resolutions. As we witness and engage the current crisis in Gaza, the UCC has been clear from the first days that there can be no military solution and that the violence must end. Israel and the US are required by convention obligation to prevent genocide, and the International Court of Justice affirmed that in its ruling on January 26th. Our partners in the Middle East have been affected directly, and we have accompanied them through prayers, support, advocacy, and public witness. The prophet Isaiah tells us, "The Lord of hosts expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry." We see that bloodshed and hear those cries too. Our partners in the Middle East do not want charity. They seek justice. We continue to work for justice because we hear the cries of our partners. God expects that. May God heal us, encourage us, and embolden us that we might be instruments of God's peace in this world, a peace replete with justice, peace, and equality, love, and hope.
For your convenience, we have provided a list of our partners located in Palestine and Israel. They reflect many years of respect and hard work. Take a moment to read the short descriptions. These organizations and institutions still provide important services to the Palestinian people. In this section, we introduce UCC resources and resolutions that can be useful for adult classes and discussion groups. Here, for example, we have 4 webinars produced by the United Church of Christ Palestine Israel Network discussing elements of the 2021 General Synod Resolution. The title is Declaration for a Just Peace Between Palestine and Israel. General Synod resolutions on the Middle East issues go back to the 1980s. The United Church of Christ Palestine Israel Network is responsible for introducing 3 of the most recent resolutions cited here. Each provide helpful background information, biblical theological reflection, and calls for action. They make an easy-to-access base for sermons, congregational resolutions, newsletter articles, adult discussion groups, and more. Check it out.
This section examines some of the challenges churches, their clergy, and their members face in speaking out boldly about justice for Palestinians and working for peace in Israel and Palestine. One of the leading concerns is how our Jewish colleagues and friends will receive our support for Palestinians and their rights. The fear of being labeled anti-Semitic can inhibit even the most social justice-oriented pastors and congregations. There are Jewish organizations and leaders, as well as right-wing supporters of Israel in the U.S., who freely use this fear to silence legitimate criticism of Israeli policies. It is important that we are clear that criticism of the policies of the State of Israel is not anti-Semitic. Given the history of anti-Judaism in the Church and throughout history, vigilance against anti-Semitism is a critical responsibility for all Christians, particularly as we see a rise in anti-Semitic speech and behavior here in the U.S. and around the world. But understanding what anti-Semitism is and what it is not is important for any congregation seeking to become bold advocates for justice for Palestinians. The Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism shown on this slide is very helpful. Anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews, or Jewish institutions as Jewish. An article by UCC minister, the Reverend Graylin Hagler, and a resource from UCC PIN on difficult conversations with Jewish colleagues can be very helpful in this regard, and you can link to them from this slide. What might it look like to address the crisis in Gaza, as well as the long-standing injustices faced by Palestinians in congregational life? This next slide is a video of an interview with the Reverend Micah Boozy, pastor of Judson Memorial Church in New York City. Since October, Micah has not shied away from speaking out in sermons and encouraging his congregation to be active advocates for peace with justice. In this interview, the Reverend Elise Higginbotham, a member of Judson, asked Micah to talk about his own motivations as well as the experience of Judson Memorial Church during the post-October 7 period.
Hello, my name is Elise Higginbotham, and I'm a member of the steering committee of the Palestine Israel. Retake.
Okay, I'm right there with you. We'll get through it together.
Start over. Okay? Go again. Hello, my name is Elise Higginbotham, and I'm a member of the Now I'm gonna I'm thinking two thoughts at the same time.
I know this feeling very well.
Thank you. Okay, one more time, 3 times the charm. Hello, my name is Elise Higginbotham, and I'm a member of the steering committee of the United Church of Christ Palestine Israel Network, or UCC-PIN, as we're more commonly called. UCC-PIN is the grassroots organization of our church that advocates for justice for Palestinians. We work in cooperation with our UCC Global Ministries, as well as with partner churches, both abroad and here in the US. I'm speaking to you now on UCC-PIN's behalf at a particularly troubling and distressing time. The situation in Palestine and Israel has dominated the international news cycle and profoundly touched the hearts of many of us since October 7, 2023, when the world was shocked by the violent incursion into Israel by armed militants from Gaza, followed by Israel's equally shocking full-scale military response in Gaza. The first fallout from these attacks are the awful, deadly consequences for Palestinians and Israelis, of course. But a second fallout is here in the US, even in our own churches, where our own members find themselves divided, just like a lot of the US population, by how to respond to this level of death and destruction. American Christians are concerned for the welfare of their Jewish friends and neighbors, and for the safety of Israel as a safe haven for Jews who've been victimized and abused by anti-Semitism in the past. American Christians are also horrified by reports from their own Christian partners in the Middle East about the level of death and destruction being visited on Palestinian civilians right at this moment. So, what's a pastor to say to a congregation in the face of this kind of conflict? Well, let me ask a pastor. I'm delighted to be joined here by my pastor, as well as my valued friend and colleague, the Reverend Micah Busey, who serves as the senior minister at Judson Memorial Church in New York City. Micah, welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to this conversation.
Thank you for the honor.
Judson Memorial Church is known for addressing justice and human needs, and it's no stranger to controversy. It has a reputation for taking risks and taking action on matters that some churches have been known to avoid. So can you tell me, as Judson's pastor, was addressing the Palestine-Israel issue any different? Was there anything that made it a touchier issue than usual?
Up until this moment, I would say that Israel, Palestine, and all of the layers that are part of that conflict have not been at the surface of any conversation that we've had around Judson. We have some very vocal members who have been activists who have gotten up during our celebrations and concerns, open mic time at service to share news, share invitations to rallies and marches, etc. But without being told explicitly that this was an issue to stay away from, it seemed to be just understood that it was a touchy subject, perhaps touchier than any of the other subjects that we address as a congregation. And so understanding myself as mostly an associate, assistant, junior minister, I had kind of followed protocol up until this point. Now I am senior minister, and so it is my duty, I think, to speak truth about what I'm noticing in the world And it is also my duty to risk getting in trouble and getting into what John Lewis would call good trouble, in terms of speaking out, especially because I have the honor of being in a pulpit, of having a congregation who will listen to me and consider themselves in conversation with me, and also because I'm honored to work at a church where some folks, even outside our walls, pay attention to what we say and do.
So, Micah, I recall your very first sermon not too long after October 7, when I first heard you use the words ceasefire in Gaza, and my heart jumped. What led you, as a person of faith and as the pastoral leader of a congregation, to take that position in that way publicly in a sermon?
It was a journey. I am one who is blessed to be surrounded by other pastors and leaders from other faiths who I can call on when I have questions that are really poking at my brain and my heart and my spirit. So for me, the first step was taking myself seriously enough to not take myself too seriously and understand that I am not in this alone. And so the first step was to reach out to my fellow pastors and then to expand that circle and basically reach out to other faith leaders and be in dialogue and understand that I'm not making the decision to speak out about this on my own. Then I went to a different circle and I talked to some congregants, especially to some of the congregants who have been more vocal about the plight of the Palestinian people, and asked them sort of, where has Judson not met you up to this point? How can we be following you, listening to the voices that you've been listening to? So basically all of this was me just understanding that I'm not bearing some weight on my own. I am in community. I am in dialogue with other people. And then in the second sermon, where I actually didn't just call for a ceasefire, that sermon that you're remembering, but the second sermon where I tried to elucidate my reasoning for it a little more, I took what I called a circle approach. So I presented to the congregation that they could expand their circle in terms of how they are thinking about this present conflict and the larger history and context that surrounds this conflict. And so if it's okay, I will say very quickly that the circle approach it's an initialism, it's an acronym, right? It leads to spelling out circle. So C is call your representatives and demand a ceasefire, because the suffering of civilians in order to satisfy empire's fragile ego is never acceptable. The second I is inhale and exhale, and don't fear that you have to speak or write or post immediately without first grounding yourself and thinking through what you have to offer to this conversation. And then R is reach out with care and empathy to your intersecting circles, because every single person knows at least one person on every single side of the false binaries that war creates. The second C is commit to protection for the most marginalized and listen to their experiences of bigotry and xenophobic violence and rhetoric. Then L, let go of your need to be right in anything you say and leave room for the expansion of your heart, your mind, and your spirit through nuance and complexity and multiple truths. And then the E is educate yourself. Not just by doom scrolling through mainstream media, but by reading history and poetry and sacred texts and following new accounts on social media that maybe you have avoided before or didn't know about, especially from those whom you feel most separated from. So that's my circle approach. And I have to remind myself every day of each of those things. And for me, that being part of the journey of being able to actually from the pulpit trust myself to call for a ceasefire meant that it wasn't just me sending an edict down to the congregants who were listening. It was an invitation to an action. It was an invitation to collective communication and continuing communication, so that we could ask questions and that it could be safe for us to approach this decision that I was making as a community.
Thank you so much. I love the circle approach. And I think in your response, you actually addressed the next question I was going to ask you. So I'm going to skip down one. So now you have invited your congregation to join you in advocating for a ceasefire in Gaza using the circle approach. How have they responded? Have you gotten any pushback from your members, and how have those conversations gone for you?
By and large, I would say that the response has been very positive. We even have congregants who have stepped up and are leading both large and small actions in response to what's happening currently. So we have large actions that congregants have planned from some upcoming Talking Heads events and arts events that will keep a dialogue happening in our physical space. We have a congregant who now is collecting money for eSIM cards to send during the communication blackout in Gaza, so that Palestinians can feel that they have ways of sending out the stories and the witness that they have to share. And so we have multiple ways that congregants can plug in. If you've got hours of time or if you've got a moment of time. And I feel like that invitation has been what lays the groundwork for congregants who might be tiptoeing around the issue to actually feel like they can open themselves up without swallowing too much, because it can feel very large and very difficult to navigate. And so, as a leader, I have just called upon myself to essentially at every step share that I'm figuring it out as well, that this is faith in action. I like to say that I preach in the form of a question, that essentially I have my own opinions. I have things that are shaping the statements that I'm making. But I know that my faith calls me to always know that there are things far larger than me. There are truths far larger than the truth I have decided on. And so remaining open while remaining committed to my own integrity and finding the tension therein, if I'm playing out that action and that continuing balance in front of the congregation, it welcomes curious congregants to think, oh, the person in the pulpit is also working this out. Then that's an invitation for me to continue to work it out. Now, I've also gotten some pushback. It can be very, very difficult to, even in a sermon where you get, 12 to 22 minutes to kind of try to work your way through all of the possible things that somebody could challenge. Essentially, there have been folks who are reading even my approaching of this issue as inherently anti-Semitic, right? Mm-hmm. There are folks who are fearing the moment that I start to talk about my call for a ceasefire, and supporting this broadening call for a ceasefire as being the foundational step before we get to all the other things. There are folks that as soon as they hear me say that in a sermon, I can feel that their brains click and the listening ends. And basically, I think they're just starting to take notes to send, to talk to me about after, or send in an email, or I've even gotten handwritten notes. The main approach that I have, and it is extremely difficult to actually every day remind myself of this, but it's not about me. And in saying that, I will say the violence that's happening is not about me. the war that's happening is not about me personally. And whatever trauma and history that folks who are pushing back are speaking from or challenging me from, that's also not about me. And so understanding that any kind of pushback or attack or accusation of anti-Semitism, accusation that I don't know what I'm talking about, not about me. I preach in the form of a question. If folks want to come and talk to me and find me, wonderful. I will say, as the final note here, I especially got pushback from one member who has rescinded their membership. And they wrote a note that essentially said, I see where Judson is headed, and I can't in good conscience be a part of this anymore. And so I can't be a part of Judson. And I had this moment, right, where I thought, I will write back point by point my responses to this, right? And then thankfully, I had this, annoying thing called the circle approach that told me I had to inhale and exhale and reach out and let go of my need to be right. And so instead, I wrote, I am really sorry and sad to read this. If you would like to talk about any of these things, I am certainly open to it. And signed my name. And a couple of days went by and I received a response back that was far more measured, seeking connection. And, the person has not come back as a member of Judson. I will also note that they were not a regularly attending member of Judson, right? But they essentially said, I will keep your invitation in mind. And then they elucidated more what pain they're talking from, where it hurts. And for me, that is always the question that I feel is the most pastoral question. When someone is attacking you, particularly when it's something that feels as just hot button as this, I think, where does it hurt? Where in this person's history is this pain coming from? Where in this person's context is this person's vitriol coming from? And granted, I do not think that everyone should be a person who holds space for that, right? I'm not asking Palestinians to hold space for that right now. I think that there are very specific people who enter very specific spaces in very specific roles. And I consider myself as a pastor to be one of those people, that I can both speak the truth that I have on my heart, but always keep myself open enough to meeting someone where they are, asking, where does it hurt? Where can I meet you? And then finding in the tension in between those two things is where the actual truth lies. And we can hold multiple things at once. We can hold multiple truths at once while also paying deep attention to who is being marginalized, who is at risk currently, who is being murdered, how many lives are being lost, and what kind of lives they are. And so it's a continual balance. But for me, that's how you keep faith in action. And that's how you stay active as a pastor.
I hear a big dose of pastoral humility, both in you, but also in the circle method. And that's an important part of addressing this issue, which raises so many strong and contradictory feelings, and I really appreciate that. What about in the community or among clergy colleagues, and particularly Jewish colleagues? Have you had some hard conversations about anti-Semitism outside the church?
I have had conversations, and I will say, though certainly, to use your word humility, I think I want to stay in a humble place when I am talking, especially to Jewish colleagues, to Muslim colleagues who are already existing in systems that have been created by the myths and the lies of Christian supremacy in the world. And so I always come with a bit of humility, just because I know how much violence and how much of even this violence is really attached to just the ways that Christianity has moved so violently through the world and throughout history. So it's interesting, because I don't know that I would say that the conversations with clergy colleagues, especially Jewish colleagues, have been hard, because I have generous Jewish clergy colleagues and I have humble clergy colleagues. And so I can actively feel them approaching using this little bit of a circle approach, right? That it is about meeting and dialoguing. It's about asking, where does it hurt? Why are we not meeting right now? And why can we not agree on this? And I do think, when I get these messages from folks who say, you don't even know what you're talking about, my answer is, you're right. I don't know what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about, though, is that I know that tens of thousands of people are dying. I know that this violence has been going on, and that there are those in power who have the power, and in my view, the imperative, the ethical imperative, to stop it. That's what I know. The other things I don't know. That's why I'm seeking dialogue. And so, I'm very blessed to have interfaith, interspiritual colleagues and leaders within those realms who really will meet me and educate me, and also ask me. And it's therein that we find all of these truths. And I would argue that for any pastor, no matter where you are, you can find those voices. You can find the people who will meet you and enter those spaces and those conversations with humility, with invitation, and with generosity.
Wow. I'm very touched by everything you've said. Thank you so much. Just to sum up, if you had to quickly summarize what have been your most important learnings from this process. I know we have pastors out there who are wrestling and praying with how or whether to raise this matter with their own churches. If you had words of thoughtful advice to give them, or particular learnings, what would they be?
I would say, and I say this with humility, as a pastor, as a Christian pastor, you have nothing to lose. You actually have nothing to lose. I understand that difficult conversations may come. I understand that I am not in anyone else's context, and that I have a congregation that very specifically does allow for some experimentation, and it allows me to have a landscape where I can ask these questions. But as a pastor, I really do want to invite other pastors to listen deeply to the still small voice that is happening inside them, that is being co-created all the time inside them. And for me, I like to pray this prayer that is to the God within me and the God beyond me. And for me, that's where the sweet spot is. What am I feeling inside me? What am I being called toward? And what is that God that's outside of my own ego? What is that calling me toward? If I get too hampered down by kind of my fear of saying something, then I avoid actually listening to all of the divine voices that are outside me, that are coming out of Gaza right now. All of the voices that I think are the divine people who are being dehumanized by this violence. And so for me, I really do wonder, what does a pastor have to lose if they just enter this, even just through the form of a question at first? Invite the conversation. If you are scared of your congregation, then there's other problems that you have.
Amen.
Right? Step out of the fear and truly call other clergy people, call other pastors. You are not in this alone. And oftentimes I feel like the pastor's life can feel very lonely. It can feel like you are shouldering all of these things and no one else knows how difficult and hard it is for you to be shouldering all these things. Get over yourself and realize that you have nothing to lose, and you especially have nothing to lose by talking with other Christian pastors and other leaders of other faiths and just calling the question, what are you all thinking? A lack of dialogue is actually what brings us to horrifically violent moments. A lack of understanding one another's humanity and stepping toward one another and asking the questions, and even if they feel hard, a lack of doing that, a reluctance to do that, a refusal to do that, that's how we get to these places anyway. So why not take that first step and understand that you truly have nothing to lose?
The Reverend Micah Busey, Senior Minister at Judson Memorial Church in Greenwich Village in New York City. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time, but thank you also for rising to this challenge. Thank you for addressing those challenges forthrightly. And the challenge includes being a sensitive pastoral leadership in a situation where feelings are running so high. Thank you for your work, and thank you for this conversation with us.
Thank you so much, Elise. Thanks for all you do.
For decades, Western mainstream media has mostly ignored the reality of Palestinian life under occupation, while obscuring Israel's undemocratic behavior toward all Palestinians and Israel's violations of international law and human rights norms. Corporate media has embraced the dominant narrative of Israel as, quote, the only democracy in the Middle East. It relies heavily for its sources on Israeli authorities, including the Israeli Defense Force, and has therefore at times uncritically amplified Israeli propaganda. The story of beheaded Israeli babies is one recent example. Meanwhile, the media has tended to portray Palestinian resistance and their struggle for freedom as terrorism. It is no surprise, then, that many in the United States, including our own UCC members, can misunderstand the apartheid conditions that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and inside Israel are subjected to. Many people are likely also to be unaware of the nonviolent civil society movements that have been working tirelessly to bring about change. One way for congregations to cut through media bias is to broaden their sources for news and analysis. On this slide are several helpful media outlets providing a fuller perspective from that of mainstream corporate media. Support for Israel from both Republican and Democratic administrations, as well as both parties in Congress, has been a hallmark for decades of U.S. foreign aid, as well as diplomatic engagement in the United Nations and elsewhere. While the U.S. has presented itself as an honest broker in numerous peace initiatives, it has been anything but a neutral participant, something our Palestinian partners remind us about regularly. Jewish and conservative Christian lobbying groups like AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and CUFI, Christians United for Israel, are powerful and well-funded voices that help skew American public opinion and resulting foreign policy heavily in favor of Israel, with little sympathy for the impact on the occupied Palestinian population, and without regard to our own laws requiring adherence to human rights norms by foreign assistance recipients. Understanding the deeply entangled financial, political, and diplomatic ties with Israel is essential for understanding why Palestinian rights and aspirations are so regularly ignored. Americans have a long history of using economic leverage to protest injustice. Colonists, prior to the American Revolution, boycotted British tea to protest the taxes. In the civil rights movement, African Americans famously boycotted the bus company in Montgomery, Alabama, to demand an end to Jim Crow in public transportation. Later, church groups boycotted Gallo wine to support farm worker organizing in California, Mount Olive pickles to demand better wages for farm workers growing cucumbers, and Nestle products to protest the aggressive international marketing of infant formula that was discouraging healthier and less expensive breastfeeding in developing countries. During the 1980s, the UCC joined ecumenical and interfaith coalitions demanding corporate divestment from South Africa to advocate for the dismantling of apartheid. In 2005, Palestinian civil society called for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, against Israel until it complies with international law and universal principles of human rights. Also in 2005, the UCC's General Synod called for the use of economic leverage to advance peace with justice in Israel and Palestine. Then, when economic leverage was having no effect, the 2015 General Synod passed a resolution that named several U.S.-based multinational corporations for divestment because they were profiting from Israel's occupation. That same synod called on UCC members to boycott products made in illegal Israeli settlements and to advocate for sanctions holding Israel accountable for human rights violations as a condition of continued foreign aid. Calls for support of BDS from across pro-justice, pro-peace organizations have provoked a powerful backlash, resulting in anti-BDS laws and sanctions in the majority of U.S. states. BDS has been falsely labeled anti-Semitic, and its criminalization has received bipartisan political support across red and blue states alike. Palestinians and their allies are regularly admonished to protest nonviolently. Yet those same admonishing voices are quick to condemn BDS and to suppress free speech and nonviolent advocacy, even though it reflects a long and honored American tradition. Check to see how your state views BDS, what laws there may be in place to criminalize it, and what can be done to protect the freedom to engage in nonviolent protest. This decades-long and emotionally fraught conflict that diminishes life and flourishing for Palestinians and Israelis as well can confound or overwhelm people, including church members. Some may see little hope for resolution and doubt that they can make a difference. But in reality, there is much that people of faith can and must do in support of justice and freedom and genuine peace. We can take inspiration from Palestinians and their spirit of samud, which is to say, persistence and steadfastness. In spite of the odds, Palestinians continue to work for a future free of violence and oppression. A future where Palestinians and Israelis both will enjoy freedom and justice and can live in peace and unafraid. Where to begin? An urgent first step is advocacy. Contact your elected officials and demand that they call for an immediate permanent ceasefire in Gaza and to stop U.S. military aid to Israel. Urge them to say, as Jesus did, no more of this. Ceasefire is a necessary prior condition in order for other conditions to follow and be addressed, specifically the exchange of hostages and the provision of food, clean water, fuel, and medical deliveries to Gaza and its now starving population. Also insist that the U.S. immediately resume the desperately needed funding of UNRWA. Use links on this slide to make your voice heard. If your congregation has endowment funds, learn whether any of them are invested in companies that are profiting from Israel's occupation and their current attack on Gaza. You might also look at your own investments if you have some. Support the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement through responsible investing and boycotting of products made in West Bank Israeli settlements. The BDS website, which you can link to from this slide, can help you get started with this research. You and your congregation can let your voice be heard by passing a congregational resolution calling for a ceasefire. You can then share that with elected officials. And you can also leverage that to encourage ceasefire resolutions in your community, in your union, in other organizations to which you belong. Make your commitment public with signs and banners, and join demonstrations identifying yourself as a person of faith who's speaking out. Another action that your congregation can take is to contribute to the many groups and organizations providing critical humanitarian aid during the current crisis and beyond. United Church of Christ through Global Ministries is one channel for your contributions and a way your congregation can join with the wider UCC in a meaningful response. And there are many other organizations listed here, for example, that are also making a difference and doing vital work. Individual members of your congregation may also want to give. Encourage them. Another action your congregation can undertake is to learn about the Apartheid-Free Congregations Initiative, organized by an interfaith coalition including the United Church of Christ, first convened by the American Friends Service Committee. This initiative engages congregations in a process of study and reflection, much like the open and affirming process. Through this process of discernment, a congregation then decides about taking the apartheid-free pledge shown on this slide as a way to make public its commitment to stand against apartheid and other forms of oppression, and to stand for justice and equality for all. It is important to stay informed about and current with what is happening in Palestine and Israel, and there are many, many ways to do that. You can sign up for the Middle East Third Thursday alerts through the UCC Global Ministries. And you can also follow the updates, analysis, and articles of organizations like those listed on this slide. Your congregation will want to continue to engage in study of this issue over time. Numerous opportunities are available. For example, you can study and discuss recent General Synod resolutions or statements from Kairos Palestine. There are many excellent books that describe the realities of life for Palestinians under occupation, as well as those that offer theological and biblical reflection. This slide lists just 3 examples. Congregational groups may also want to gather for film nights and see and then discuss one of the many excellent films about Palestine and Israel. This slide also lists some examples of those. Talk about this issue. Encourage neighbors and friends and family and the wider church community to become involved, not just during the current crisis, but in sustained ways into the future. Keep this issue before your state senators, your congressional representatives, especially during the upcoming elections. Where do they stand? Find out. Let them know where you stand. Advocate. Write letters to the editor and write op-eds. And consider bringing a resolution from your congregation to your conference annual meeting as a way of widening the circle of congregations that are discussing, paying attention, and getting involved in advocacy and witness. UCC PIN's mission statement says in part, with Jesus' commandment to love in our hearts and the Palestinians' cry for hope calling us to action, we covenant to educate, equip, and mobilize the United Church of Christ for bold prophetic witness and risk-taking advocacy toward the goal of a just and genuine peace in Palestine and Israel. Our hope is that this resource, Crisis in Gaza, will help to equip you and your congregation to advocate for justice for the people of Palestine and Israel as they struggle and work to secure freedom, equal rights, harmony, and peace for all. We encourage you to stay connected with UCC PIN. Sign up for our monthly newsletter if you're not already receiving it. Use our educational resources and give us feedback. Let us know how you've used them and how they've worked for you. And join us in the struggle for justice and peace.